Hello and welcome to our Signal broadcast. Our topic today is the government's recently announced plan for growth. And so to get a little bit of insight into what this week has been like for local business owners, I thought I'd talk to a couple who have got particular experience or are operating within the sectors that have been most significantly impacted by the government's announced changes and cuts. And with me is William Cox, and William is a financial advisor and a pensions transfer specialist. So, Will, I imagine you've had a really interesting week on the back of the government's announcement. So start by telling us your response to the announcements last Friday.
Yeah. So I was surprised about how large it was. It wasn't necessarily a budget, because it didn't need to go through the Office of Budget Responsibility, which do all of their normal detailed assessments and projections. When you hear terms like mini budget, you expect sort of a few minor announcements. It will impact a few, well, not a few people, but a large amount of people, but in a minor way. But instead, what we saw, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, was the largest tax cut to the planned level of tax of any budget since 1972. So mini isn't really a good word to describe it. Second largest could be. But like, I understand that energy costs are going up, and that affects lots of areas such as food bills, transportation costs, heating your home, manufacturing. So I can see why the government felt the need for action. And the government itself is in quite a difficult situation, really. How do you provide relief to individuals and companies so that they can pay their bills, but also not feed the flames of inflation?
Right.
So, yeah, so the risk that comes with the measures were announced, the risk that comes with the measures that were announced is that it provides an economic stimulus that is likely going to contribute to inflation getting worse. So we have the government doing one thing. Now, if we take a look at what the Bank of England are aiming to achieve, they have an annual inflation target of 2%. We are currently at around 9.9% in August. So the Bank of England has a fair bit of work to do. So what are they doing? Well, they're increasing interest rates to try and get inflation under control, making it more expensive to borrow money, so people borrow less and start saving more, which reduces the amount of money in circulation. If we take a step back and look at what both the government and the Bank of England are doing and look at their policies, we'll see that they don't really seem to be aligned. Government policy is stimulating the economy through tax cuts, and the Bank of England policy is trying to slow the economy through interest rate rises. So what I potentially see happening is inflation getting worse due to tax cuts, leading to the Bank of England getting more aggressive with their interest rate rises to combat inflation. This will then make things such as unfixed mortgages more expensive, which then further deepens the cost of living crisis. So to answer your question about what I made of the budget, I think it was sort of counterintuitive to what the Bank of England are trying to achieve. And maybe a less flashy, boring budget is probably what we needed. It's not what everyone wants to hear, but it's what I think was probably needed.
As a financial advisor, and particularly as a pensions expert, I imagine what you're looking for in the markets is a certain amount of predictability and stability.
Yes, the markets do like predictability and stability. That is where stock prices are generally going to go up, because the market likes knowing what's coming. And with inflation continuing to go up, that's an unknown. What the Bank of England's going to do and how far they're going to go, that's unknown. If we look at investments and pensions, though, if we take a look at the global stock market, the UK is only 3.9% of the global stock market. So if you have diversified investments and pensions, and you don't have all of your eggs in one basket, say in the UK, then yes, your investments might be impacted partly by what was announced last week. But in the grand scheme of things, if you're properly diversified, then it shouldn't have too big of an impact, and you shouldn't be too worried at this stage.
Okay, so in terms of what are the kinds of questions that your customers are asking you in the wake of all of the changes that happened on Friday?
So that's an interesting question. Well, it's only been about, I think, 3 days. Well, it's actually been about a week, but 3 working days since the budget was announced, mini budget was announced, and I haven't really been asked too many questions. So when I create a plan for my clients, I try to reduce their risk by investing their money in a range of asset classes. So if you imagine stocks and shares being one of them, and bonds, which are essentially loans to companies, being another. I invest them in a range of those, so they might be counter-correlated in some situations. When the stock market goes up, you wouldn't hope that bonds go down, but they are generally counter-correlated in the way that when the stock market goes down, bonds might go down a little bit, or they might actually go up. What we're looking at right now is actually something that hasn't really happened that much in the past, and that is both equities, so stocks and shares, and bonds going down at the same time. So it's sort of a bit of a turbulent situation at the moment. But that's part of that. That's one of the ways I diversify my clients' investments. I also invest in investments all across the world, really. So they might have some money invested in areas such as the US. They might have a little bit in the UK, Europe, Asia, all over the world. So they wouldn't be too impacted by the events of last week. So
are you worried about the fact that interest rates have gone up globally? I know they were put up in America, across Europe, in the Middle East, the Far East, India as well.
Yes, so the US stock market, I haven't checked it today, but it's down about 20% this year alone. But what we have seen, for example, is with the devaluation that has occurred with the pound, they've sort of balanced each other out. So whilst the pound weakens, the money that you had invested in the US is going up essentially. So the stock market might be down by 20% in the US, but UK individuals that have bought US investments in pounds have actually seen an uplift due to the pound weakening. So
everything is balanced. It's just you were seeing some unusually large fluctuations in unusual areas. But in your view, this is all going to settle down over the next few weeks?
Settle down over the next few weeks might be a bit soon. I'm not an economist. One thing that I always say to my clients is if you ask 5 economists the same question, you'll get 5 different answers. You don't know what the market's going to do in a year's time, 2 years' time. All we can really do is manage the risk, as I mentioned, diversifying across world markets and different asset classes. Things aren't going to go up at the same time all the time, and you necessarily don't really want that, because I always say you'd always want to be disappointed in at least one fund in your portfolio, because then it's doing something that the other ones aren't doing. You're not aiming to get a huge return investing in bonds and asset classes like that. They're meant to be safe sort of investments. So when the stock market does go south, then you have something to prop up the investments and you don't lose as much money. If you've got all of your money invested in the US stock market, for example, then your whole portfolio is dependent on that one market doing well. Whereas diversifying allows you to really, it's not going to net you 10-15% returns every single year, but it means that you can be more relaxed, and it's probably a bit more boring because you don't see wild swings in your investments, but it helps people sleep at night. And in reality, people don't want to be concerned about whether their future is going to be reliant on one particular market. So do
you think that UK pension funds are going to be affected by the fact, for example, the warning from the IMF for irresponsible behaviour from the government in terms of risking our bond values, the pension, the gilts that we hold in pensions, all of that? Were you concerned by any of that?
It was quite concerning, actually, particularly for the UK government, really, and obviously as citizens living in the UK, it affects us as well, because what we saw happening was gilt valuations essentially decreasing, crashing at quite an alarming rate. And the impact that would have over the long term is why the Bank of England really stepped in. Because if you take a look at gilts, which are the loans to the UK government, they are generally considered quite safe investments, or previously they've been considered quite safe investments.
Right. Yeah.
So they've generally had quite low interest rates associated with them, which means the cost of the government servicing the interest payments due to be paid because of those bonds, those gilts, could be quite low. What we saw happening is the value of a gilt going down. I should probably explain how a gilt really works before I delve into that.
Yeah, can you do it succinctly in a way that I fully understand it? Because I know gilt is another word for bond, right?
Yes. A gilt is just a bond to the UK government, essentially. So if you imagine a gilt has three parts. One is something called a redemption value. Then there's an interest rate, and then there's a time frame. So when a new bond is issued, it may state that there is a redemption value of £100 with a 3% interest rate over 30 years. So for 30 years, you get 3% of that £100, so £3 every year. And at the end of that time period, you get £100 back.
Right.
So that's broadly how they work. However, after a bond has been issued, you can buy a bond for more or less than the redemption value because you're buying it on a secondary market. So that has the impact of either increasing or decreasing the interest rate associated with the bond at a sort of subsurface level. It doesn't change it on the bond itself, but because you're buying a £100 bond for let's say £50, then you'd still get the redemption value at the end of the term of £100, and you'd also get 3% or £3 every single year for holding that bond. So when we saw the gilt market crash, that would increase the interest rates that would be associated essentially with those gilts that are being held, which means when the government wants to issue more gilts in the future, then to remain competitive, they would need to issue them at higher interest rates.
Right.
Now, that makes the cost of debt servicing by the UK government more expensive. So why the Bank of England stepped in is because if the gilt market continued to crash, then when the government needs to raise money in the future, it would be really expensive for them to service and cause an issue in that regard. So that's what they try to avoid. So that's
we'll see how it works.
We'll see how it works. The Bank of England has currently essentially put a little bit of a floor in the valuation at the moment of gilts. So it's stabilized a little bit, but something to definitely keep an eye on.
So I think it's creating something of a sort of catch-22, or perhaps even a vicious circle, because as I understand it, the government of these unfunded tax cuts are presumably obviously going to increase borrowing, and at the same time they've increased the cost of borrowing, which will mean they have to increase borrowing. So I guess we're all a bit nervous about that, but let's wait and see if the Bank of England can sort it out. And let's hope that you're right, and we're all going to put all of our eggs in lots of different baskets and continue to diversify our pension funds and hope. And are you optimistic that we'll all just get through this with our pensions intact?
I mean, if the past is anything to go by, the stock market always has essentially gone up. We've got hundreds of years of stock market returns that we can look at, and things are not the same valuation as they were, let's say, 100 years ago. So you just got to learn to weather the bad storm, essentially. And the hardest thing to do sometimes is, and it's the right thing to do, is to do nothing. But when you're in times like this, you want to do something. So you've got to sort of think, no, I'm not going to touch anything, because chances are if you do touch it next week, it will go up, and then you need to wait for the opportunity to get back into the market, and then you have to ask yourself, when do you get back into the market? So
stay in your supermarket queue, don't change, just hang on.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's the right thing to do in the majority of cases, really.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I feel like we've ended on a positive, strong and stable note. I feel confident that my pension is going to give me the returns that I need. So thank you, Will, for joining us and sharing all of your insights about the past week.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emma.